The rope burns your wrists. Your mouth tastes of copper and terror. You've been dragged through corridors lined with velvet and gold corridors you once believed led to salvation. Now, naked and shaking, you stand before men draped in scarlet, who regard your body not as a soul, but as an instrument. One of them smiles. The marble is cold beneath your knees. You realize, with sickening clarity, that the hands which bless the faithful are the same hands that ordered this. The records don't lie. They can't. Centuries later, the ink has faded, but the truth remains etched into ledgers, whispered in ambassadors' letters, coded into the marginal notes of traumatized clerks. What happened within the walls of the Vatican during the Renaissance wasn't just moral failure. It was a system, deliberate and documented, where sanctity became theater and power devoured everything it touched. Before we descend into this darkness, I want to ask where, in the world, are you watching from? It genuinely amazes me that a story this buried, this uncomfortable, can still find people hungry for truth across every continent. The year is 1501. The Papal States glitter with artistic genius, Michelangelo's chisel, Raphael's brush, architecture that will define beauty for centuries. But inside the Apostolic Palace, something else is being created. Johannes Burchard, the Pope's master of ceremonies, sits at his desk each night and records what he has witnessed. His diary is meticulous, cold, precise. He does not editorializes. He does not need to. The events speak for themselves. On October 31st, Hallows Eve, he writes of a banquet. 50 women brought to the papal apartments, not guests, not dignitaries, performers, he calls them, though the word hardly captures what follows. They are made to crawl on hands and knees across marble floors, gathering chestnuts scattered between candlesticks. While men in ecclesiastical robes watch and wager on the spectacle, cardinals place bets. Servants are ordered to record who finishes first, who collapses, who weeps. Burchard's Latin is unflinching, coram papa before the Pope. The Pope in question is Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI. His election in 1492 wasn't decided by prayer. Venetian ambassadors recorded the transactions for mule loads of silver delivered to Cardinal Sforza's palace the night before the conclave. Promises scrawled and sealed, votes purchased like grain. One diplomat wrote home with bitter clarity, the Holy Spirit had little to do with this election. Gold did the work. But to understand how the papacy could become this a marketplace of flesh and favors, you have to go back further to trace the architecture of impunity. The rot begins with names that history has tried to forget. Pope John XII, mid-10th century, whose own clergy accused him of turning the Lateran Palace into something between a brothel and a royal court. Liudprand of Cremona, a chronicler whose bias we must account for, still catalogued accusations too specific to dismiss entirely. Ordinations sold, mistresses installed in Vatican apartments, families silenced with benefices and land. Medieval sources are slippery. They blend fact and invective, politics and pornography. But beneath the rhetoric, patterns emerge. Payrolls for servants, assigned to special guests. Legal petitions from families demanding dowries returned. Marginal notes and account books that refer, with bureaucratic detachment, to payments for discretion. What these fragments reveal is not merely individual sin. They show a system learning to operate in shadows. The papacy was both a spiritual office and a territorial power. Cardinals commanded armies, bishops governed provinces, the church's wealth rivaled kingdoms, and wherever power concentrates without accountability, it begins to devour its own stated principles. By the time the Renaissance arrives, the machinery is already in place. The sale of offices simoni has become routine. A young man of no particular piety but excellent family connections can purchase a cardinal's hat for the right price. That cardinal can then sell benefices, collect tithes, and leverage his position into dynastic wealth. The system feeds itself. Documents in the Vatican secret archives show contracts, receipts, notarized agreements where church positions are traded like livestock. Rodrigo Borgia understood this machinery better than anyone. Before becoming pope, he had already fathered at least 4 children with his long-term mistress, Venazia de Catani. He installed them strategically. His son, Cesare, became a cardinal at 17, not for devotion, but for control. His daughter Lucretia was married and divorced, and remarried according to the shifting needs of papal alliances. Her body and her name mere instruments of statecraft. When Rodrigo ascended to the papacy, the entire apparatus bent to his will. Ambassador reports describe evenings that blur into nightmare. A Ferrari's envoy writes of women brought in great number to Vatican chambers, where they are displayed, assessed, used. Not as individuals, but as demonstrations of power, of access, of the collapse of all boundaries. These weren't private indiscretions hidden in shame. They were performances calculated to show that rules no longer applied, that the man who could absolve sin could commit it with impunity. One account, corroborated across multiple sources, describes a night when courtesans were invited to the Pope's quarters. Stripped and made to compete in acts so degrading that even the jaded diplomats recording them used euphemisms. Burchard's diary entry is clinical. Other letters are horrified, but none of them stop it, because stopping it would mean challenging a system everyone depended on. Lucretia Borgia's life is a case study in how women were consumed by this machine. Modern historians debate her agency. Was she victim or accomplice? The truth is probably both and neither. She was married at 13 to Giovanni Sforza, a political pawn. When the alliance no longer served Alexander's purposes, the marriage was annulled on grounds of non-consummation, a humiliating lie that Sforza contested publicly, claiming the real reason was far darker. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was murdered, stabbed on the steps of St. Peter's, then strangled in his sickbed when he survived the initial attack. Cesare Borgia's hand in this is almost certain, though nothing could be proven. Lucretia, 19 years old, stood beside her dying husband and then was married off again within the year. She left behind letters carefully composed, often censored, that reveal a woman navigating impossible choices. She patronized poets, corresponded with intellectuals, managed estates with competence. And yet every decision she made was framed by the reality that her body, her alliances, her children were not her own. They belonged to the Borgia project. Cesare is the purest distillation of what the Renaissance papacy could produce. Made a cardinal as a teenager, he resigned the position as soon as it became tactically useful, something virtually unheard. Avant became a warlord. His campaigns across the papal states were exercises in calculated terror. Niccolò Machiavelli, who met him personally, was both fascinated and repulsed, later using Cesare as a model for the prince or ruler who understood that fear, when wielded with precision, could accomplish what love never could. Cesare didn't just conquer, he erased. Families who opposed him vanished, sometimes in battle, more often through poison or quiet assassination. His father provided papal troops, papal funds, and papal bulls, declaring his wars just. The documents don't hide this. they're startlingly open. Payment ledgers show money flowing from Vatican coffers to Caesar's military chests. Letters from Alexander refer to Caesar's work with paternal pride, and when enemies within the church itself became inconvenient, they died suddenly. Cardinal Mitchell, Cardinal Orsini wealthy, influential men who opposed Borgia policies, fell ill after dinners at the Vatican and were dead within days. Their estates were immediately confiscated, redistributed to loyalists. Autopsies were not performed. Questions were not asked. Chroniclers noted the pattern but wrote carefully accusations of murder against a sitting pope were dangerous. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Poison, likely arsenic or cantarella, a compound that mimicked natural illness, food or wine at a seemingly cordial meal, symptoms that appeared days later. By the time the victim died, the Pope could publicly mourn while privately seizing their wealth. Diplomatic dispatches described this cycle with weary familiarity: opposition, invitation, sudden illness, death, asset, seizure. Foreign ambassadors cataloged it all. The Venetian Senate's archives are particularly rich. Spies embedded in the papal household sent detailed reports. They weren't writing for posterity. They were gathering intelligence. But their letters now serve as cross-verification, independent witnesses to events that apologists later tried to dismiss as Protestant propaganda. The Reformation wouldn't begin for another decade. These are Catholics writing to Catholic courts, describing Catholic horrors. What makes the Borgia papacy so historically significant isn't that it was uniquely evil. It's that it was so thoroughly documented. Earlier popes may have been equally corrupt, but their crimes were scattered, contested, or lost. Alexander VI's reign is preserved in excruciating detail because, by 1500, bureaucracy had become sophisticated and diplomacy prolific. The mechanisms that enabled his corruption also recorded it. In 1503, both Alexander and Caesar fell violently ill after a dinner at a cardinal's vineyard. Rumors immediately spread that they had been poisoned, some said by an enemy. Others whispered they had accidentally consumed wine they'd intended for their host. Alexander died within days, his body reportedly decomposing so rapidly that it had to be forced into its coffin. Cesare survived, but was broken, his military power evaporating the moment his father's protection vanished. The funeral was chaos. Servants refused to touch the corpse. No prominent clergy would preside. Alexander VI, who had held the keys to heaven and hell, was shoved into a too-small coffin and buried with less ceremony than a merchant. The contrast was absolute. A man who had wielded limitless power reduced to meat that even his own staff found repulsive. Within weeks, the palaces were emptied. Lucretia withdrew to Ferrara, where she would spend her remaining years as a duchess, patron, and mother, her past a shadow she could never escape. Caesar was imprisoned, escaped, and died in a minor skirmish in Spain, a forgotten prince in a pointless war. The Borgia name became a synonym for depravity, but the system that created them that survived. Subsequent popes enacted reforms, commissioned investigations, and publicly distanced themselves from Borgia excess. Yet the financial structures, the sale of offices, the nepotism, the conflation of spiritual authority and temporal power, those remained. The same ledgers, the same titles, the same mechanisms, because the problem was never just Alexander VI. It was an institution that had learned to monetize salvation and discovered that, once you've tasted that power, reform becomes a threat to survival. The Reformation, when it came, would cite these abuses as evidence that Rome had become Babylon. Martin Luther's 95 Theses attacked indulgences, but beneath that theological dispute was a visceral fury at what the papacy had become, a court where bodies and souls were equally tradable. The Protestant break wasn't inevitable, but the Borgia years made it possible. Here is what the archives force us to hold. These weren't myths invented by enemies. They were acts recorded by allies. Burchard served Alexander faithfully and wrote down what he saw. Venetian ambassadors reported to Catholic masters the marginal notes in Vatican ledgers were written by clerks who depended on papal favor. The truth survived because too many people saw it, and enough of them, whether from disgust, political calculation, or simple bureaucratic diligence, wrote it down. The Borgia story ends, but the question it raises doesn't. What happens when the institution that defines morality exempts itself from moral law? When the men who hear confessions believe themselves beyond judgment? When sanctity becomes performance and power the only sacrament that matters, there's no satisfying resolution. The Renaissance papacy produced pieta and poison in the same breath. It funded Sistine ceilings while trafficking in human degradation. The same hands that commissioned Raphael's Madonna signed orders that destroyed lives. We want history to be simpler monsters, separate from saints, darkness distinct from light. But the documents insist otherwise. What remains, 5 centuries later, is a warning written in faded ink and cold marble that power, when sanctified, does not become holy. It becomes unaccountable, and institutions built to guard the sacred can become, with chilling efficiency, instruments of its destruction. The ledgers are still there. The letters still exist. The stones of those palaces still stand. They do not argue or apologize. They simply testify. And if we are willing to read what they serially read it, without flinching, they ask us a question we still haven't answered. What do we do when the guardians become the wolves?